Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the Pacific dawn break across the horizon on June 4, 1942. The same sun that had illuminated Japan's stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies now cast its golden light upon what he believed would be another triumphant day. 6 months of unbroken conquest had made the Imperial Japanese Navy seemingly invincible. Its carriers strike force the terror of the Pacific. Today, they would crush the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet at Midway atoll. The morning air hummed with anticipation aboard the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Zero fighters warmed their engines while dive bombers and torpedo planes prepared for what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had promised would be the decisive battle. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: draw out the American fleet, destroy it completely, and force the United States to negotiate a peace that would leave Japan master of the Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the first wave of 108 aircraft toward Midway at 6:30 that morning. Below them, the vast blue expanse concealed a secret that would shatter Japanese confidence forever. Unknown to Nagumo and his staff, American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz precious advance warning of the attack. The Americans weren't walking into a trap, they were setting one. Captain Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor had worked tirelessly through the spring of 1942, piecing together fragments of intercepted Japanese communications. Their breakthrough came when they confirmed that AF, a mysterious designation in Japanese messages, referred to Midway atoll. This intelligence coup, later documented in numerous naval histories, including Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, allowed the Americans to position their forces with deadly precision. As Tomonaga's bombers approached Midway, they found not a sleeping garrison, but a hornet's nest of defenders. Marine fighters rose to meet them while anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from Sand Island and Eastern Island. The Japanese pilots, veterans of 6 months of easy victories, suddenly found themselves in a real fight. Tomonaga's Kate bomber shuddered under hits from Marine Wildcat fighters, but he pressed his attack with the dedication that had made the Imperial Navy feared across the Pacific. The first bombs fell on Midway at 6:36, sending geysers of sand and debris skyward. Fuel tanks exploded in orange fireballs while concrete bunkers cracked under the assault. Yet the defenders fought back with unexpected ferocity. Major Floyd Parks led his Marine pilots in desperate attacks against the Japanese formation, trading their outdated aircraft and often their lives for every enemy plane they could bring down. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo received Tomonaga's radio message. At 7 o'clock, there is need for a second attack wave. The words carried ominous implications. Midway's defenses had proven stronger than intelligence had suggested. More troubling still, reconnaissance flights had failed to locate the American fleet. Where were the enemy carriers? The answer came at 7:28 when Lieutenant Amari Tone's floatplane finally spotted the American task forces northeast of Midway. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, was already launching aircraft. Task Force 17 centered on the damaged but operational Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Prepared to follow suit, Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. His second-wave aircraft sat on deck armed with land attack bombs from Midway's installations to strike the American carriers. He needed to rearm them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, a process that would take precious hours. The flight decks of his carriers became scenes of frantic activity as ordnance crews rushed to swap weapons while fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War. As the sun climbed higher over the endless blue, neither side yet understood that they were about to witness the death of Japanese naval supremacy and the birth of American dominance in the Pacific. The pride of the rising sun was about to meet its greatest test. The thunder began at 9:25, when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's former executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, led 15 Army Air Force B-17, flying fortresses in a high-altitude attack against Nagumo's carriers from 20,000 feet. The Japanese fleet looked like toy ships scattered across a blue tabletop. The massive bombers dropped their loads with mathematical precision, but hitting a maneuvering carrier from miles up proved nearly impossible. Towering waterspouts erupted around the Japanese ships as they twisted and turned, but not a single bomb found its mark. Admiral Nagumo breathed easier as the Army bombers disappeared toward the horizon, but his relief was premature. At 9:30, 26 obsolete Marine Corps dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson screamed down from 12,000 feet. These were not the modern aircraft that had dominated European skies. They were outdated Vindicator and Dauntless dive bombers flown by pilots who had never seen combat. Yet they pressed their attacks with the fury of the desperate. Henderson's Dauntless plunged toward the carrier, anti-aircraft fire raking his wings. At 3,000 feet, his plane shuddered and began smoking, but the Marine Major held his dive. At 1,500 feet, with his aircraft in flames, Henderson released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled up. The bomb missed, and Henderson's plane cartwheeled into the sea. But his sacrifice inspired his wingmen to press home attacks that brought them within yards of the Japanese flight decks. The Japanese carriers erupted in defensive fire. 5-inch guns barked while smaller weapons created walls of steel. Zero fighters dove from their combat air patrol, their 20mm cannons chattering death. One by one, the Marine bombers fell. Major Benjamin Norris pulled out of his dive with his engine trailing smoke, only to be caught by 2 Zeros. His Vindicator disintegrated under their guns, adding another name to the growing casualty list. But the Americans were just beginning. At 10:15, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet appeared on the horizon. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers in what would become one of the most heroic and tragic attacks in naval aviation history. These aircraft, designed in the mid-1930s, were no match for the modern Japanese defenses, but Waldron pressed forward with grim determination. The sea round the Japanese fleet became a killing ground. Zero fighters swarmed down like angry wasps while every gun in the fleet opened fire. Waldron's Devastator was the first to fall, its pilot's voice crackling over the radio. "Watch my smoke." The big torpedo bomber hit the water in a geyser of spray and flame. One by one, his squadron followed him into the sea. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched from his life raft as the carnage continued. According to his later memoir, documented in naval archives, he witnessed the systematic destruction of his entire squadron. While floating among the wreckage of his aircraft, 15 planes had attacked. Only Gay lived to tell the tale. The slaughter continued as Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived at 10:40. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 Devastators into the same deadly gauntlet that had destroyed Waldron's squadron. Japanese Zeros fell upon them like hawks. Among sparrows, Lindsay's plane burned and crashed while his wingmen died around him. Only 4 of his aircraft survived to limp back toward Enterprise. By 11 o'clock, the Americans had thrown away nearly 60 aircraft for no measurable result. Japanese sailors cheered from their positions while Zero pilots claimed victory. After victory, Admiral Nagumo began to believe that American air power was as overrated as Japanese intelligence had suggested. His carriers had emerged unscathed from the morning's attacks, and his own strike force would soon deal with the American fleet. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something. Their crews never lived to see the low altitude. Attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At that very moment, 2 squadrons of American dive bombers were approaching from opposite directions, ready to deliver the blow that would change the course of the Pacific War forever. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in a desperate search for the Japanese fleet. Fuel gauges showed critical levels as the American pilots scanned the endless Pacific. McCluskey had gambled everything on his navigation. extending his search pattern beyond safe return limits. Just as he prepared to turn back, a lone Japanese destroyer appeared below, racing northeast at flank speed. The destroyer Arashi had been hunting the American submarine Nautilus, which had boldly attacked the Japanese carriers earlier that morning. Now, unknowingly, she was leading McCluskey directly to Admiral Nagumo's flagship. At 10:24, McCluskey spotted the telltale wakes of the Kido Butai spread across the blue Pacific, like a deadly constellation. Below on the carrier Akagi, organized chaos reigned on the flight deck. Maintenance crews worked feverishly to rearm aircraft for the strike against the American carriers. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the wooden planking, while fuel lines snaked between parked aircraft. It was a scene repeated on all four Japanese carriers, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie approached from the south, with 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, timing his arrival with mathematical precision. The Japanese had made a fatal error in their defensive positioning. While their combat air patrol dealt with the low-flying torpedo bombers, the sky above 10,000 feet lay virtually undefended. The stage was set for what naval historians would later call the fatal 5 minutes. At 10:26, McCluskey pushed over into his dive, selecting the massive Kaga as his target. Behind him, his pilots followed in the graceful, deadly dance of dive bombing. The dauntless aircraft plunged earthward at angles approaching vertical, their pilots fighting G-forces that threatened to black them out while they lined up their targets. In their telescopic sights, Lieutenant Richard Best, McCluskey's wingman, noticed his flight leader diving on Kaga and made a split-second decision that changed history. Banking sharply left, Best selected Akagi Nagumo's flagship as his target. The pride of the Japanese fleet, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, now lay defenseless beneath his diving bomber. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck at 10:26. The explosion ripped through the wooden planking and detonated among the armed aircraft below. Secondary explosions followed as aviation fuel ignited and torpedo warheads detonated. Within moments, the great carrier was transformed from an instrument of war into a floating inferno. 30 seconds later, Best's bomb struck Akagi just behind her island superstructure. The 1,000-pound warhead punched through the flight deck and exploded among the planes. Being rearmed below, a chain reaction of explosions followed as bombs and torpedoes detonated in sympathetic harmony. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck of his bridge by the force of the explosion, watched in horror as his flagship began its death throes. Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment, catching the carrier Soryu in the middle of launching aircraft. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a sea of flame. Planes ready for takeoff became flying torches while aviation fuel spread fire throughout the ship. Within minutes, Soryu joined her sister ships. In agony, the transformation was complete and terrifying in its swiftness. At 10:25, the Japanese had possessed for operational aircraft carriers and the initiative in the Pacific War. By 10:31, 3 of those carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks collapsed and their aircraft destroyed. The pride of the Imperial Navy had been reduced to floating pyres in less than 6 minutes of combat. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on Soryu's bridge as flames engulfed his ship, refusing all entreaties to abandon his command. The tradition of Bushido demanded that a captain die with his vessel, and Yanagimoto would not break faith with centuries of naval honor. Round him, damage control parties fought desperately to save ships that were already beyond salvation. The fatal 5 minutes had rewritten the strategic balance of the Pacific. In less time than it takes to boil an egg, American dive bombers had accomplished what 6 months of Japanese victories had made seem impossible. They had broken the back of the Kido Butai and shifted the momentum of the war. Captain Tomio Kaku of the aircraft carrier Hiryu stood on his bridge at 11:15, watching 3 of his sister ships burn on the horizon. Black smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the blue Pacific sky, marking the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. But Hiryu remained untouched, her flight deck intact and her aircraft ready for vengeance. The last surviving carrier of The Kido Butai would not go down without a fight. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu's Bridge, embodied the fighting spirit of the Imperial Navy. A graduate of the Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island, he understood American capabilities better than most of his colleagues. Now he prepared to demonstrate that Japanese naval aviation still possessed the power to strike back. At 11:30, he launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force. Through towering cumulus clouds, his Kate bomber loaded with a single massive bomb. Behind him flew some of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. These men had never known defeat, and they approached their target with the confidence born of 6 months of victory. The target was USS Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship and the newest of the American carriers. The ship that had rushed back from the Coral Sea battle with hasty repairs was about to face her sternest test. At 12:10, Kobayashi's formation appeared on Yorktown's radar screens, prompting immediate action. Stations throughout the ship. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch led 6 Wildcat fighters from Yorktown in an innovative defensive maneuver that would bear his name for generations. The Thatch Weave allowed the slower American fighters to compete with the superior Zero through coordinated mutual support, as documented in Thatch's post-war interviews with naval historians. This tactical innovation proved crucial in the developing air battle. The Japanese bombers pushed through the defensive screen with typical courage. Kobayashi's aircraft shuddered under hits from anti-aircraft fire, but he pressed his attack with single-minded determination. At 12:20, his bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck near the island's superstructure, punching through the armored deck and exploding in the ship's uptakes. The carrier shuddered to a halt, her boilers extinguished and her flight operations suspended. But American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within 2 hours, Yorktown's engineering crews had her steaming again at 20 knots, her flight deck patched and operational. From a distance, she appeared undamaged, leading the Japanese to believe they faced a fresh carrier when their second strike arrived. At 2:45, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga returned to battle leading 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. The same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway now commanded Hiryu's final strike. His aircraft leaked fuel from battle damage, but Tominaga refused to abort his mission. The code of Bushido demanded that he complete his attack regardless of personal cost. The torpedo attack pressed home with deadly precision, despite the defensive fire of 12 destroyers, and Yorktown's own anti-aircraft batteries to torpedoes struck the carrier's port side at 2:47. The explosions opened massive holes in her hull, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her dead in the water. This time, there would be no miraculous recovery. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria as Yorktown began listing heavily to port. The carrier that had helped win the Battle of the Coral Sea now faced her own destruction in the waters off Midway. Yet her sacrifice had not been in vain. Her aircraft had already delivered the blow that would doom the Japanese fleet. At 3 o'clock, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from Enterprise toward Hiryu's position. The last Japanese carrier maneuvered desperately, while her escorts threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire. But the Americans had learned the lessons of the morning's attacks. Approaching from multiple directions, they overwhelmed the Japanese defenses. Through sheer coordination and determination, 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into an inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his situation was hopeless, prepared his ship for her final battle. The Emperor's eagles had fallen one by one, and now only burning wrecks remained of the force that had once seemed invincible. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood in Hiryu's firelit bridge as flames consumed his flagship around him. At 4:30, in the afternoon of June 4, 1942, the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier in the Kido Butai was dying. Through the smoke and heat, he could see his staff officers watching him with expressions that mixed reverence with desperation. They knew their admiral well enough to understand that he had already made his decision. Captain Tomio Kaku approached his superior with tears streaming down his face. "Admiral, we must abandon ship. The fire has reached the hangar deck, and the aviation fuel tanks are in danger of exploding. Around them, damage control parties fought a losing battle against flames that had already consumed half the ship. The pride of the Imperial Navy was being reduced to twisted metal and ash." Yamaguchi removed his Naval Academy ring and handed it to a young ensign. "Take this to my wife," he said quietly. "Tell her that I died as a samurai should, with honor intact." The tradition of Bushido that had sustained the Japanese military for centuries now demanded the ultimate sacrifice. A commander who lost, his ship must follow her to the bottom, accepting responsibility for defeat with his life. The evacuation of Hiryu proceeded with the discipline that marked the Imperial Navy at its best. Wounded sailors were carried topside while uninjured crew members formed human chains to pass supplies to waiting destroyers. Yet through it all, Yamaguchi remained on his bridge, watching the sunset over a battle that had destroyed Japanese naval supremacy forever. At 7:30, as the last boats pulled away from the burning carrier, Yamaguchi raised his binoculars for a final look at the horizon. In the distance, columns of smoke marked the positions of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor and conquered the Dutch East Indies. Now they were funeral pyres, their aircraft and crews feeding the flames that illuminated the Pacific twilight. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan had lost for fleet carriers the backbone of her naval aviation capability. More critically, she had lost over 300 experienced pilots, men who had taken years to train and could not be replaced quickly. As documented in post-war Japanese naval records, this loss of skilled aviators would prove as devastating as the destruction of the carriers themselves. Captain Kaku made one final plea to his admiral. "Sir, the Emperor needs experienced commanders, more than he needs martyrs. Your death serves no purpose." But Yamaguchi's mind was made up. In his final radio message to the combined fleet, he took full responsibility for the disaster while absolving his subordinates of blame. At 8:30, the destroyer Kazugumo reported massive explosions aboard Hiryu as her aviation fuel tanks detonated. The carrier broke in half, her bow and stern sections pointing skyward like the fingers of a drowning giant. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku went down with their ship, joining the thousands of Japanese sailors who had died that day in defense of their emperor. Meanwhile, aboard the listing Yorktown, damage control efforts continued despite the overwhelming odds. Commander Clarence Aldrich led teams deep into the carrier's flooded compartments, searching for ways to save the ship that had become a symbol of American resilience. The carrier had taken torpedo hits that would have sunk most vessels, yet she still floated, her crew refusing to accept defeat. The human cost of the battle was becoming clear as rescue operations continued through the night. The Japanese had lost approximately 3,500 men, including some of their most experienced carrier pilots. American casualties, while significant, were far lighter, about 300 men killed or missing. The mathematical balance of naval warfare had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. As midnight approached on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway entered its final phase. For Japanese carriers lay on the bottom of the Pacific while Yorktown drifted helplessly, her fate still uncertain. The rising sun's greatest naval defeat had been written in fire and blood, but the consequences would echo across the Pacific for years to come. Japan's pride had indeed been tested at Midway's battleground and found fatally wanting. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed the full magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the Imperial Japanese Navy. For aircraft carriers, the pride of the combined fleet, trusted on the bottom of the Pacific, their hulks scattered across miles of ocean floor. Yet the Battle of Midway was not finished, and USS Yorktown, though crippled, still floated defiantly on the morning swells. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich had worked through the night, leading damage control parties deep into Yorktown's flooded compartments. The carrier listed 26 degrees to port. Her flight deck canted at an angle that made walking treacherous. Seawater had flooded her lower decks, but her compartmentalized design, a lesson learned from British naval architecture, kept her afloat. Against overwhelming odds, Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, faced a critical decision. Should he risk additional ships to save Yorktown, or write off the carrier as an acceptable loss? The strategic situation had shifted dramatically in America's favor, but the war was far from won. Every ship would be needed for the long campaigns ahead. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had refused to abandon his command, remaining aboard Yorktown with a skeleton crew of volunteers. These men worked around the clock to stabilize their ship, knowing that Japanese submarines prowled the surrounding waters. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide electrical power and pumping capacity, her crew joining the desperate effort to save the wounded carrier. Unknown to the Americans, Commander Yahachi Tanabe aboard the Japanese submarine I-168 had been stalking the crippled carrier since dawn. The submarine, part of a cordon deployed by Admiral Yamamoto, had been ordered to intercept any American ships fleeing the battle. Now Tanabe found himself with a prize beyond his wildest expectations, a stationary aircraft carrier protected by only a handful of destroyers. The submarine approached with the patience of a hunter, using Yorktown's bulk to mask her periscope from the screening destroyers. Tanabe studied his target through the periscope's narrow field of view, calculating range, bearing, and the proper spread for his torpedoes. At 1:25 in the afternoon, he gave the order that would seal Yorktown's fate. Fire all tubes. 4 Type 95 torpedoes streaked through the blue Pacific water, their wakeless tracks invisible to the American lookouts. The first torpedo struck Yorktown amidships with a thunderous explosion that sent a column of water and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The second torpedo found Hammond, breaking the destroyer's back and killing 81 of her crew instantly. The destroyer sank in for minutes, her depth charges exploding as she plunged toward the bottom. The underwater detonations hammered Yorktown's already weakened hull, opening new leaks and worsening her list. Captain Buckmaster realized that his ship was finally doomed. At 2 o'clock, he gave the order to abandon ship. The evacuation proceeded, with American efficiency, lifeboats and life rafts carrying away the last of Yorktown's crew. Buckmaster walked through his ship one final time, checking every compartment to ensure no man was left behind. The carrier that had helped win the Coral Sea and dealt devastating blows at Midway was finally succumbing to her wounds, yet Yorktown refused to die quickly. Throughout the night, she drifted on the Pacific swells, her list increasing gradually but her spirit unbroken. Salvage crews prepared to make one final attempt to save her, towing her back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The carrier had become a symbol of American determination, battered but not beaten, listing but not lost. As reported in contemporary U.S. Navy dispatches archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, Yorktown's survival through the night of June 5 demonstrated the superior damage control training that would characterize American naval operations throughout the war. Her crew's dedication to their ship exemplified the fighting spirit that would ultimately triumph over Japanese militarism. Dawn on June 6 would bring the final chapter in Yorktown's story, but already her sacrifice had helped secure the most important American naval victory since the War of 1812. The submarine's shadow had fallen across the wounded carrier, yet even in defeat, she had contributed to a triumph that would echo through history. The morning sun of June 6, 1942, illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible. Just 48 hours earlier, USS Yorktown still floated on the Pacific swells, her massive hull refusing to surrender despite torpedo damage that had killed her sister ship USS Wasp. In similar circumstances months later, the minesweeper Vireo had taken the carrier under tow, attempting to bring the wounded giant home to Pearl Harbor. Captain Elliot Buckmaster watched from the destroyer Benham as salvage crews worked frantically aboard his former command. The carrier listed heavily to port, her flight deck awash, but her engineers had managed to restore partial power. For a few precious hours, it seemed that American determination might yet save the ship that had become a symbol of Pacific Fleet resilience. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Aboard his flagship Yamato, 300 miles to the west, faced the most bitter decision of his distinguished career. The architect of Pearl Harbor had gambled everything on destroying the American Pacific Fleet at Midway. Instead, he had lost for irreplaceable aircraft carriers and the cream of Japan's naval aviation. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the United States. At 6:02 on the morning of June 6th, Commander Yahachi Tanabe's submarine I-168 struck again. 2 more torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's starboard side, the explosions echoing across the water like thunder. The carrier's back finally broke under the assault, her hull buckling amidships as compartments flooded beyond any hope of control. Yorktown began her final plunge at 6:08, her bow rising majestically as her stern settled into the Pacific depths. The stars and stripes still flew from her mast as she slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the battle flag that had flown over American victories from the Coral Sea to Midway. 307 officers and men had given their lives in her service, but their sacrifice had helped secure the most important naval victory in American history. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Midway became clear in the weeks that followed. Japan had lost not only for fleet carriers, but also 322 aircraft and over 3,000 experienced aircrew. The combined fleet's offensive capability was shattered beyond quick repair. Admiral Nimitz's gamble had paid off spectacularly, shifting the balance of naval power in the Pacific decisively toward the United States. Emperor Hirohito received word of the disaster in the privacy of his palace study, his face betraying no emotion as Admiral Nagano delivered the devastating report. The divine wind that had protected Japan for centuries had failed at the moment of greatest need. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, lay in ruins on the bottom of the Pacific. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood immediately that the victory at Midway had changed the character of the Pacific War. No longer would American forces fight a desperate holding action against Japanese expansion. The industrial might of the United States, fully mobilized for war, could now project power across the Pacific with growing confidence. The human dimension of victory remained uppermost. In the minds of the survivors, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation had located the Japanese fleet at the crucial moment, would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the triumph. But he never forgot the price paid by the torpedo squadron pilots, who had died to create the opportunity his dive bombers exploited. As the Pacific Fleet returned to Pearl Harbor, crowds of sailors and civilians lined the harbor to welcome the victorious ships. The battle that had begun with such grim prospects had ended in America's greatest naval victory since John Paul Jones defeated HMS Serapis in 1779. The pride of the rising sun had been tested at Midway's final battleground and found utterly wanting. Japan would continue fighting for 3 more years, but never again would her fleet challenge American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The ashes of 4 aircraft carriers scattered across the Midway Deep had fertilized the seeds of ultimate Allied victory. From that moment forward, the question was not whether Japan would lose the war, but how long her leaders would delay the inevitable surrender.